Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you for joining this fourth webinar from the National Consortium of Societal Resilience. My name is Duncan Shaw. I work at the University of Manchester, and I'm delighted that we've got Paul Cull here from New Zealand. He's going to be talking about some of the work that he's been doing in Wellington region around community hubs and their use for resilience during COVID and beyond. Joining me today is also Claire Mills. Claire's from NAVCA, and I'm very grateful to her. She's going to be organising the Q&A. So please, as the webinar does start and continue, please do put your questions into the chat function so that Claire can extract those and structure a conversation around them. Stuart Marshall's also with us. Stuart's going to bring it all together for us and summarise an hour's conversation in a few minutes, and trying to extract key issues for the UK. For some of you, I suspect this is the first sort of touch with the consortium, and so I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction to who we are, what it is that we're doing. The consortium is a collection of resilience partnerships and sector partners from across the UK. We cover about 97% of the UK and the population of there, and Crown dependencies, Jersey, Guernsey and Isle of Man. We involve partners from the voluntary sector, from business sector, government sector, and really trying to understand what does societal resilience mean in these different contexts, and all pursuing a shared vision. That shared vision is to focus on whole society approach to resilience and thinking about what can individuals at home, individuals in households, what can they do? What can community groups do, businesses and organisations, so the voluntary sector and other parts of local government, how can they all work together to build resilience? Just to give you a very quick shout out to the next webinar that we'll run, that's on the 31st of January, and it's with Chile. We've been working with Chile for a number of years with their youth Ministry for Youth, developing a spontaneous volunteering programme, and so they're kindly going to come and talk about the work that they've been doing and how touching with youth has been really transformational in their country. So I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen and let Paul start sharing his screen. You might remember Paul from a webinar that we did, our second webinar with FEMA. Paul joined SUVA at that time and was talking very briefly about some of the great work that he was doing in New Zealand, and it seemed really fitting to invite him to come and spend some more time talking about that work in New Zealand, and so we can learn a little bit more from it. Paul, this is work you've been deeply involved in leading, so may I hand over to you, and welcome, and thank you very much for your time this morning or this evening.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody, unless you're my side of the planet, in which case it's good evening. But thank you so much for this opportunity. As you know, I have been involved with the CERT Community Emergency Response Team program since about 2003, mostly internationally. I've worked with CERT teams in 8 countries overseas. But since the beginning of last year, I've been working here in New Zealand with what we call the Wellington Region Emergency Management Office. So that's basically civil defence or emergency management in the region of Wellington. That's our capital district here in New Zealand. So we work with 8 territorial authorities, city, district councils, to provide the emergency management services. And as part of this work, I'm Community Resilience Advisor. Like all of us, I guess, have been quite involved in the operational response to COVID and other things that have been happening. But I've come across the Community Emergency Hub model that we have here in Wellington. I'm not a big fan of that name. I don't know if it's the same thing in the UK, but here in New Zealand, it seems like the name hub is sort of the word of the moment. So my local coffee shop's a hub, the library's a hub. Call it whatever you want. I do think the emergency hub model is very cool. So that's just what I want to talk about briefly. Please interrupt me if I'm going too fast or too slow or get distracted or use too many Kiwi words. Basically, I'm sure everybody's aware of the Christchurch earthquake sequence that happened in 2010, 2011. I'm actually from Christchurch. I wasn't present on the major earthquakes, but starting in September 2010, we had an earthquake sequence. The 4th of September one was quite a strong quake that resulted in a lot of damage, but no fatalities. Then on the 22nd of February 2011, we had a shallow 6.2 quake right underneath the central city, destroyed about 90% of the central business district of Christchurch, and resulted, unfortunately, in 185 fatalities. Now, parts of Christchurch were without utilities and services for up to a year in some suburbs. And there was an amazing community response to that, of course. As always happens, there were a number of reviews into the emergency management response of the Christchurch earthquake. And one of them came up with 6 suggestions or themes for improvement in our emergency management system here. One of these themes was that we should be recognising the significant role that the community and community organisations play in responding to emergencies and linking that closely to emergency management. Of course, linking what the community does to the emergency management system isn't always easy. Here in New Zealand, we use the Coordinated Incident Management System, SIMS. So that's basically just an incident management model that works from the national level through to the regional level where we sit at, and also at the local council level, but down to the incident level, the same system is used. And after the reviews into the Christchurch quake, we had a revision of SIMS. We've now got the 3rd edition that came out end of 2019. So we started using the 3rd edition for the COVID response. And we do try to recognise that really everything we do in emergency management is all about communities. That's the focus and that's the purpose of everything we do. However, I do think it's kind of sad if you look at this page I've taken out of the SIMS 3rd edition manual. It shows all the different layers and levels of the official response, the different lead and support agencies involved. And you see how there are all sorts of lines and dashes and dots connecting all these different components of the official response. But although the communities recognise down there, there's no official connection with the community. And of course, that's always the problem when we have a command and control system like the SIMS that we're using here, because communities, their community response is very different. It's often uncoordinated, spontaneous, unofficial. And so the big challenge is how do we do what the review recommended and try to link the official or the unofficial response into the official emergency management structure. That can be a challenge because, of course, the community response, we have those existing groups, the humanitarian, voluntary agencies, and they may be on our radar. We might have MOUs, some of them. Of course, we get those expanding groups, like here in New Zealand, we had a lot of food banks that we were able to give additional resource to, and they expanded the folk they were able to help during lockdowns. Then you get those extending groups like residents associations or communities of faith that post-impact, they start reaching out and being part of the response into their community. Now that's often a more difficult challenge for us to find those groups, but they still are kind of structured and they do exist if we can locate them. Of course, then we get to those emergent groups, and this is always the challenge, as happened after the September 2010 quake in Christchurch. Some students at the Canterbury University started a Facebook page, and before we knew it, there were 3,000 students in their gumboots and with their wheelbarrows and their shovels on the streets, basically clearing up the liquefaction, which is a major problem after the quake. And of course, the official emergency managed response didn't know what to do with these young people. But from what I understand, it was initially tried to be shut down until they were able to understand what an incredible resource the student volunteer army was. Fortunately, by the time the February quake came along, they already had some understanding of the incredible power of these emergent groups and emergent response capabilities. Of course, in the February quake, we had other groups that popped up, and Some of those were able to connect into the official response, but sadly others weren't. And then of course we have the spontaneous and the unaffiliated volunteers, which create their own special challenges like liability and vetting, health and safety. Here in New Zealand, we have a health and safety law, which basically means if we task a volunteer to assist us, we are responsible and liable for their health and safety. So that gets complicated when we're talking about spontaneous unaffiliated volunteers. So I'm sure everybody's aware of these challenges. So here in Wellington, the REMO, the Regional Emergency Management Office, we started developing this model back in about 2017, 2018. Initially, sort of the old civil defence model was based around sector posts in primary schools, and they started changing that to the hub model. So we've currently got about 128 hubs in the region. I'm responsible for 37 of them. Of those, about 30 of these hubs are still in primary schools. I'm not actually a fan of having them in schools. I think they're not the best locations these days. Schools, of course, have a duty of care to provide assistance to their students. And here in Wellington, we have challenges of a major earthquake would leave large parts of our region isolated. So some schools will be looking after students for up to a week, possibly. So some of my other hubs are in different locations, like a wildlife park and a restaurant that has these sort of country gardens, a library, a scout camp. And I'm a big fan of having these hubs in community locations where possible. Now, the model I'm about to present to you, although it was created by REMO, it's freely available. So it's been used by other locations and emergency management organisations in New Zealand. And we've got folk overseas looking at implementing it as well. So if anybody's interested, REMO can send you all the material about this. So what is a community emergency hub? Well, I'm going to oversimplify here, but I would say it's basically a sign, a box, and a radio. Now, what I mean by that is, first off, the hub is a predetermined physical location that has a physical sign. It's also on Google Maps. It's on our website. People can look up the list of their hubs. We also have a map for the public to find their hub. And in the last 3 years, we've done community surveys, and we found that about 40% of the population know where their local hub is. Of course, we'd like that number to go right up. In the last 2 years with the COVID response, we obviously haven't been pushing this so much, because when we're doing lockdowns, we don't want people turning up for hubs, but most of our hazard scenarios are things like floods or tsunamis or earthquakes where the hub concept would work. Now, as well as the predetermined physical location, it's basically a small kit of equipment that you can see in that photo. It's not civil defence supplies, baked beans and blankets. It's a bit stationary, an FM radio and a torch, a manual, what we call the hub guide, and these lanyards. And that's sort of basically all it is. It's just enough for us to give these suggestions of how the community can organise itself during response. And then when I say a radio, we actually do have these somewhat prehistoric VHF radios that would connect into our emergency operations centres, but that's really the last resort. They would work off car batteries if nothing else is available, but obviously, in fact, our radio guides tell them to try mobile phones or email first. Well, that would be a better means of communication. But the important thing here is that there is a channel of communication into the official response through the local emergency operations centre. So it's not just the community doing their stuff, but there is a connection back into the EOC. So just briefly talking about the hub guide, this is a manual that's mostly the same in every hub. It's got 5 chapters of basically standard information. There is a facility map. These hub guides are available on our website, so there's no sensitive information involved, but it's just giving us the suggestions of how the community could organise the operation of the hub. There's also a chapter that we get them thinking about the recovery process while they're still within response. But then we have one chapter, the chapter 5, which is the community response plan. Now, in an ideal world, we'll get the community together beforehand while we're about to open the hub to work out what are the resources and the vulnerabilities that are available. So this is where we can talk about things like asset-based community development techniques and appreciative inquiry, and get them thinking about what are the local resources, local vulnerabilities, the groups and networks, the places and spaces, services and businesses, and the infrastructure. And just sort of high level, just so that in that sort of initial response phase, they can just start thinking where they need to check and where they can go to get resources. So we're looking at things like medical assistance, shelter, water, food, and sanitation. Now, I should explain that the hubs are not shelters. They would not operate 24 hours. It's basically that sort of not the initial response where the official response would go, but it's more the communities that might be on their own or very limited resources, as happened in Christchurch for some cases, months. So we also get them to look at some of the challenges like damage assessment and how they're going to respond in their community. Now, we also in that kit, we have 8 types of lanyard. Now, this I think is the secret sauce of the whole hub model, and I'm a big fan of how this has been developed over the years. I'd like to say, I unfortunately didn't have anything to do with developing it, but I've been using it with community groups, and I just think this is a really good model. So we suggest that they organise the hub around these 8 roles or functions. One person has to be the hub supervisor, of course, and they will just make sure everything's working. They might be responsible for the key, so that the facility owners know that somebody's responsible. We actually have 4 lanyards for the role of reception, because we think this is really important, so that as people come up to the hub, they can be encouraged to come in and also sent to the appropriate part of the hub for to receive assistance. One of the largest, I think, greatest value of the hub is actually through the needs and offers desk or needs and offers board. Might be a couple of big notice boards. And what we're trying to do here is that as people turn up to the hub, if they've come to offer assistance, whether that's skills or manual labor, or that's some sort of donation or material goods that they're offering, that we try to connect the two. So we don't want that avalanche of useless donations that so often happens, but we do want to try and connect what people need with what people are able to offer. And that often happens spontaneously. So we saw in Christchurch that the butchers that lost their power, they were donating all the meat in their freezers to the local community, who were then getting the barbecues out and cooking it up. So these things happen, and it's just a case of trying to formalize that more. So that might be on notice boards. Some of this information might be more sensitive, so we might keep that on sheets of paper, contact information, and just what's available and what's required. Obviously, we need to think about things like medicines and some of those things that maybe you don't want to put up publicly. Now, as well as the needs and offers board, we have the public information. Of course, this is just so important. That might just be a notice board outside the hub, and it might be that people just pop along to the hub, read what's on the public information board, and that's all they need. Maybe we're getting the information about boil water notices, or when particular resources or services are going to be made available. So obviously, that's why we've got the FM radio. If at all possible, they'll be following us on social media for the official information. But then we've got that link back into the Emergency Operations Centre so they can get the latest official information. So I see that as being a very important task within the hub. Now, depending on the situation, a hub may choose to open up the community space. It's basically just a place for people to hang out, have a cup of tea. Now, that might be some psychosocial assistance or psychological first aid. Might be that people are waiting for needs or offers, and just a place for the community to be if that's what they choose. In our scenario of earthquakes, some folk in the sequence of aftershocks mightn't feel safe at home and may choose to hang out in the community space. So it's, again, there are a number of of lanyards for that. As we see, that's a very important role of a hub if they choose to open that. Now, most of those roles are public facing. We also have a private part of the hub where we encourage them to keep this information out of public view. And this would be the information coordination task, where we've got large maps of the region and we're trying to get the damage assessment going on. Obviously, if it's a major event, there might be fatalities or destruction on a widespread scale. So we don't want that necessarily publicly visible, but we do need that information to get back to the official response. We might find that as people come to the reception, that we get them to write out or just trace their route to the hub on a map, and we can give that information to the information coordination role so they can work out what damage has been noticed and what parts of the community haven't yet been heard from or visited. And they can then look at sending out damage assessment teams. And then we've got the communication function. So whether that's through the VHF radios, or one of my hubs already got Starlink internet, so they'll be able to run that without any power if need be. So whatever means they're using to communicate back to the Emergency Operations Centre, obviously we need that in a isolated place out of the public space. The final role out of these 8, I also think is really important, is somebody responsible for maintenance of the facility. This, obviously, it might be that they don't have everything that they could want, so they're trying to keep everything going. And again, in our scenario of earthquakes, if there are aftershocks, they might check out for safety. If need be, a hub could relocate to another physical location if that's required or necessary, and put up a sign. So facility maintenance is sort of checking on the safety of the installation as well. So the big question, of course, is where do these hubs come from? And particularly, what comes first? Do we start with a pre-existing community group that will then operate the hub? Or do we create a dedicated group for the hub? Or is it possible to operate a hub without having a group of people who are already trained in the concept? And I believe the answer to that question is yes, all of the above. So in some cases, we work with pre-existing community groups. So this hub, for example, Blue Mountains Residents Association, they're already working in their community, and they're also a community emergency hub. So these pre-existing groups, churches, communities of faith, residents associations, they can add to what they're already doing the ability to be a community hub. And in that case, we're basically just recognizing, enhancing what they're doing and connecting it back into the Emergency Operations Centre and the Emergency Management System. So for example, I was visiting this hub just the other day. We do an audit of the equipment, check out the radios. And here in New Zealand, we're just in the phase where we're starting to prepare for COVID in the community and people isolating and being treated at home. Fortunately, we've hit the 90% vaccination rate, so we're hoping that this won't be a major issue at this point. So obviously, community groups like this resident association, they're starting to prepare on how they will check in on their community and help people who are isolating or being treated at home. And they asked me, well, can we use the stuff in the hub kit? And I was like, well, of course you can. Now, if it gets to that point that we have to step in as emergency management to assist with this phase of our COVID response, then of course that would activate as a hub. But if not, they're already doing basically what the community would need anyway. Now, in some cases, we actually start with a dedicated group that want to form a local hub. So this community here, Manor Park, they came to me at the start of last year and they wanted to have a community emergency hub. So we did some training with them, household and individual preparedness. Then we did the community response planning phase. And then we always do a hub activation exercise. They didn't have a physical location, so we did the exercise, as you can see here, in somebody's garage. Then somebody who had the local store, the general store, we call them dairies here in New Zealand, that had closed down, and they offered that as a location for the hub. So the hub's in the local, what used to be the dairy or the general store, and that is now the physical location for the hub. Now, what we found there that was really cool, this group is continued as a hub group, and we just did another exercise again. They've revised their response plan, but they've also started expanding to other activities. So they linked in with the City Council for what we call neighbourhood support, which is like a neighbourhood watch program. They also made a connection recently with another organisation called Predator Free New Zealand that works with trapping so that to protect our wildlife. And so that enabled them to get other groups of local residents involved in other activities that also connected them with the hub and ensures that the hub keeps going. And they're also preparing now for COVID in the community and preparing isolation kits and getting a list of people that will mow other people's lawns if they have to isolate at home for a couple of weeks. So once again, the hub is sort of performing that role of a residents association, even though it started as a hub group and may not be an official emergency response, but they're still reaching out to the community. But then we get the final situation. What happens if we do not have an existing group or a dedicated group to operate a hub? Well, in that case, and remember I said I've got hubs in about 30 schools. I've got a couple of them, I think I know people will open in the hub, but most of those schools, we've made it very clear to the schools that their priority is their duty of care to their students and that they don't have to operate a hub at all. But it might well be that people end up at their local hub. So in this case, the location's publicised, the hub kit, the guide and the radio are there, and you check that they're working. And there are key holders identified that might be staff members from the school or even local residents with perhaps a lockbox. So somebody is available to several people usually to open up the hub in the event the community shows up. And so the idea would be that because it's a pre-identified physical space, interesting in our public surveys, we found that 60% of the respondents understood that the hub was the location where the community came together to help to solve its challenges, although only about a third of them understood that it was the community themselves that operate the hub. About half of the participants in our surveys thought that civil defence would show up. So we're trying to get that message out that it's up to the community. However, you might ask, well, would that work? Is it possible that people could show up, somebody hands them the key, shows them the hub guide and the kits and says, go to it? And the answer to that question is yes. Spontaneous hub activation really does work. And I've seen this in exercises. Just 2 weeks ago, I had the opportunity with this group of different community groups from the Pacific Island communities. And we'd done some preparedness training with them in an earlier session. And I think it was last week, can't quite remember now. I had the opportunity to outline the hub model to them. I think I spent about 10, 15 minutes all up, and that included showing a couple of small videos. And then we basically gave them the hub kit and the guide and the lanyards and said, go for it. And within about 15 minutes, they had identified from the lanyards what roles they wanted to perform. They'd set up the physical structure of the hub. So then 2 colleagues and myself, we started coming in with the exercise injects. You know, I've lost my kids, I've lost my cat, I don't speak English and I'm hungry and there's a tree down in my driveway, all these different scenarios. And they were able to solve everything we gave them, or at least work with everything we gave them. Because community groups, they know how to solve community challenges. It's what they do on a day-to-day basis. So all we're really doing is giving them a structure so they could even post-impact without training, come together and start applying the skills that they already had. Another example of this was just at the start of last year in the southern part of the South Island in New Zealand. We had major flooding. About some 4,400 people were evacuated and 26 emergency hubs activated, most of them self-activated. They were operated by over 1,000 community members. One of these hubs took on 500 evacuees that were then helicoptered out. It was the greatest helicopter evacuation ever in our history. but that all happened through a local emergency hub. Another one of them received 2 busloads of foreign tourists and looked after them. And there was another hub that activated after the residents returned home, having been evacuated, and supplied them with food and other supplies. So I am really keen to be able to investigate just how that worked with 26 hubs and 1,000 people. But very next month, COVID arrived here. And of course, our priorities changed, and we've got the chance yet to be able to see just how well that all worked. But certainly the feedback we had was that this definitely worked the way we always imagined it will. So I promise I'm nearly finished. If we think about the blue skies or of community hubs, if you like, I'm a big fan of the FEMA whole community approach, where they say that we should be strengthening what works well in the communities on a daily basis. So of course the hubs can add the capability to existing community groups, or hub groups that have been formed to start a hub can then expand to other areas, and that maintains the momentum. It means people aren't just training for something that we hope will never happen, but they're actually reaching out and helping their community in other ways. And we know that they're then able to plug into the official response in the event of a major event. And of course, in all of this is kind of a fine line between business as usual and emergency response. And this is where I'm really happy to be able to be a community resilience advisor, working with these groups so that that communication and that connection is happening pre-impact, so that if we needed to have these hubs activated, we're already talking with each other. And if we think about the grey skies situations, post-impact, if we're thinking about something major like an earthquake, we understand that the hubs might not activate until the 2nd or 3rd day of a major event, because we tell the communities to first check on their own households, maybe their immediate neighbours, maybe check on the street, and then when they think it's time and then they're okay, to go to the local hub and start to activate it. Of course, the hubs may be operated by a dedicated hub group, existing community groups, or spontaneous volunteers. And the idea of the hub is that the community comes together to resolve challenges with existing resources. However, there's always that communication back to the Emergency Operations Centre so they can get the public information. We and they can obtain situational awareness, and those requests for assistance can go both ways. If they're meeting challenges or finding challenges that they can't meet with their existing resources, they can escalate that to the EOC. Now, this is where the CERT model, I believe, would just fit in so well. If you think of the Californian CERT model, they have the neighborhood staging areas, which is basically same thing as the private part of our hubs. It's got the situational awareness and the communication. So we're just sort of adding to that, to the spontaneous or pre-existing community group that's working with the community. So that would mean that as the situational awareness is they're finding either damage assessment that needs to be done, or maybe there are incidents and situations need to be resolved. The CERT team could then go out as damage assessment or incident response teams. Okay, last line, I promise. I know when we talk about community resilience, we often like to talk about social capital. And when we think about the bonding social capital, where you have a group of people with similar values, similar objectives, working together in a tightly bonded group, that's what we often see in the CERT teams or the hub team. And that's obviously fantastic. But of course, a geographical community is not just a single bonded group. So that's where I like the idea of the hub, because we can have these different groups. Maybe they're communities of faith, maybe they're different special interest groups, or culturally and linguistically diverse groups. Maybe they're just different socioeconomic levels, but they don't have to all be a single bonded group to operate a hub. If they know where to go, they might just turn up to the hub to get the public information, maybe to contribute with the needs and offers, to give us situational awareness. And that's okay. What we're doing is through the hub model, we're creating this bridging social capital between these different groups within the geographic community. And of course, because we've got the link back into the official response, we're also creating that linking social capital up to the emergency management authorities. And that's me. I will stop talking now, and there's just some contact info if anybody has any questions for later on or would like any of these resources. Thank you so much for listening to me. Now I'm going to find out if I made sense, I guess.
Yeah, Paul, that was amazing. Thank you. I forgot I was meant to be monitoring the questions because I was just too busy listening. It was absolutely fascinating, and I've got a list of people lined up for questions so far. So if you, if I ask you to come off mute and just ask your question, and or make your comment, and we'll see what Paul responds to that. So David, I'm going to start with you, because although your question was last in the chat, you were the first one to say something on the chat way back when. So please, David Powell, if you want to come in.
Okay, thanks, Paul. First of all, thank you very much. I thought that was a great presentation, and I think it strikes at the heart of a lot of the stuff that Duncan and I have been trying to do over the last 10 years, I would say. So thank you for that on a personal level, Paul. I guess the question I'll pass on to you is really, how well informed do you think the emergency service responders and the wider official response frontline people are aware of the role of the hub? Paul, and have there ever been any tensions in either the knowledge or the lack of knowledge as a result?
It's an ongoing work as far as we're concerned, but from the emergency operations centre level, they're very much aware of the hubs, and we're working on making sure that connection is always there. So when we're thinking about, like, at the incident level of SIMS, if the local hub were to roll up to an instant control point, they would probably get told to go away, and that's okay because they're two different models. Basically, that level of our fire department, for example, showing up is not what the hub is there to do. But at the level of the emergency operations centre, the SIMS model we have under our operations function, we have a volunteer coordinator. So they would be the person creating that link into the official response from the hubs, and that would then go out to, we'd usually have fire and the other emergency services liaison officers in the EOC as well. So at that level, they would start to understand. We also tell our council EOC staff, if they can't get to the EOC, to turn up to their emergency hub, and we're trying to get that message out to the emergency services. If for some reason you're isolated, there's been a landslide, just turn up to your hub and help out there. So that is an ongoing process, of course. Hope that answers the question.
I know, and actually that last point is a really important one, Paul, that in fairness, I don't think we thought of before, actually, making the community hub the kind of go-to location if communication fails or if you can't get it. I think that's a really good additional point, actually. That's great. Thank you, Paul. Thank you for answering that question.
Thanks. I'm going to go to Carolyn Otley next. Carolyn, you had a question about, which probably relates to that, about how many hubs you need, about size of population. Are you there, Carolyn?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Yeah, Paul, fantastic talk. Thank you. I am always keen when somebody else talks about social capital and community resilience. So that's great. But yeah, I mean, I think probably my question, probably links to one Duncan's put in the chat, is I think it would just be helpful to have an idea of the scale and what kind of size of population you think might connect into a single hub, and whether it works as well in urban areas as it does in some of the more rural communities where there's a defined community, I suppose.
Yes. We do have rules about what size population should be for a hub, and I think it's like 1,000 people or within 15, 20 minutes walking distance. That's one of the reasons why my Manor Park hub, because I turned up the Remo, started last year. That's why they had never actually started as a hub, because it didn't tick the boxes. But looking at it now, that's one of my favourite hubs because they're so engaged. They've got a community of about 130 families, but they would be, just because they've got a river one side and a motorway the other, they would actually be isolated in the event of an earthquake. So to be honest, I don't think that our sort of random numbers of how many people you need always works. I would much prefer to go where the energy is. So some places, again, because we've inherited the hubs in the primary school model, I've actually got community groups almost next door to a school who are really keen to be a hub. So we've trained them as hubs, even though they're not officially a hub. We've told them either create communication back to the school or go and grab the gear off them. So I think it's really important to go where the energy is. I definitely agree with what you said about rural communities. I'm so much more organised and connected. The challenge with the suburban hubs is exactly that, and that's where I'm trying as much as possible to work with the existing groups. So we've got some churches at the moment that are interested in becoming hubs. We've got actually a hub and a mosque down in Wellington City. So I'm trying to find those groups that want to be hubs, and I think that's more important than trying to create a benchmark of what population or what distance. Just find the people who want to do it. That's what I'm trying to work on anyway. Hope that made sense.
Yeah, I think we'll come to Duncan next, although Duncan, you organise this, so you don't really get very long. You can just talk about rural and urban differences. What we'll do, we'll talk about the kind of general big picture questions first, and then come in, other people have asked about roles in insurance, but we'll come on to those questions once we've done the bigger picture ones. So Duncan, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you. I won't take long. I was interested in that rural-urban split, whether this is more attractive to rural communities or whether urban communities are equally as excited, and whether they might engage differently. So they have the physical building and people turn up, or whether people sort of get pre-involved in those groups as you described it, Paul.
Yeah, I think at the moment, most of my urban suburban hubs are the big question mark. How many of them would activate? We know that people know they're out there, and I guess in a large enough event would happen. But because again, the urban communities tend to have these residents associations, and they're obviously more resilient and more connected. They're more guaranteed that they really will work. So that's where I've been trying more and more to find these other connections, these other groups, Neighbourhood Watch or communities of faith or resident associations, that we can try to bring this more into the urban communities. One of the things I'm also hoping to try is to look at whether some of the secondary schools would like this as like an after school club. I know we've got high schools that have search and rescue, like rural search and rescue special interest groups, and I reckon we could get a high school that wants to run a hub group, that we actually physically move the hub there, and then they will drag adults along with them if something happens. So again, I think the key for the urban community is not trying to create some, although Manor Park is an example, one that created their own group, but it's trying to find the pre-existing groups and then give them the hub model will add value to what you're already doing. And it's a challenge, I must admit.
Okay, that's great, thanks. Just moving on then to Phil, you asked a question about kind of the longevity of the hubs. Phil Baker?
Yeah, exactly, thank you. And yeah, it's really great to hear all these ideas in practice. But I think my question is about, yes, how much do they tend to be self-driven, these hubs, and how much do they need external support to keep going so that in an event they do activate? I think you partially answered it already, but it'd be good to hear your thoughts.
We've got a few very dedicated civil defence volunteers who've been in it for the long term, but I believe that we're trying to change this model to accommodate either the existing groups that are not particularly emergency management focused, or the spontaneous volunteers that they're going to do stuff anyway, so get them to do it around the hub. Because that's always the challenge, and I've seen that in the CERT groups, for example. It's really hard to keep people motivated for something, particularly when there's a very high level of investment of their time and energy and finances and stuff. So this is the challenge, and that's why I'm trying as much as possible either to, like our hub group in Manor Park, that expanded into other areas, and so it's continuing, or to find other groups and then add a hub to that. Yeah, I don't think it's just like emergency management is often not the thing to keep people motivated long term, because it's something we really hope doesn't happen.
That's great.
I hope that answered the question.
Thanks. Claudine Casser, can I come on to you now? You had a question really about information and people within the hub.
Yeah, so basically, how do you kind of guarantee that vulnerable people are taken care of or not not abused, but kind of taken advantage of if they come to the hub? Is there a no loan working policy, or are people security checked before becoming hub members? But especially during spontaneous hub activations, I just don't understand how you can guarantee people's safety in a way.
Right, and basically you can't, and on paper, and that's the challenge with things like health and safety regulations. You know, we don't, obviously, if it's a spontaneous group, we can't absolutely, you know, nobody can sit down and you know, background check and whatever. I do think the structure that we've given them, so it's not just, you know, one keen person organising it, because we've given them a fairly defined structure with these different roles. I believe that allows some security into this, but ultimately, this is always the problem with spontaneous and emergent community responses, and this always happens, is that how do you get those checks and balances in there? And I don't think there's any easy answer. Again, that's why I'm a big fan of having pre-existing groups that have their own structure for handling those issues, their own leadership structure, then running the hubs, because they've already dealt with those issues somehow. And so that wherever possible, the spontaneous, the unaffiliated volunteers join one of these pre-existing groups. But I do think also that the hub structure itself, by having all those different roles, so it's not just one person's job. I have seen that in Christchurch, where, you know, one person took on basically a community response and organised it all themselves. Did a good job, but of course burned out eventually, and annoyed a lot of people because of their leadership style. So by trying to give them the structure in that box, as they start to use everybody's contributions, so as people turn up, they've got something to do and something to contribute to the hub. I think that helps create that safety to a better extent than just a spontaneous response. But it's always going to be a challenge.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that leads us on to, I'm going to, Becky saying she thinks her question might have been answered, but actually I think it's a really useful one to articulate, and around people's roles, and also maybe thinking about whether people only ever practice to be in one role or whether they practice to be in more roles. Becky, do you want to come in there, please?
Surely. I was just trying to save everyone some time, because my question was motivated by that same idea of how you make sure that you don't sort of accidentally bake in privilege by putting the same people in charge all the time. And it was interesting to hear you had that example of someone who took it all on and set it all on fire with the best of intentions. But yeah, so my question was basically about how you decide kind of who gets what role, or how you would deal with any kind of tension. So that sounds like one example. But yeah, particularly, I guess, if it's possible to speak more to where you're having to some extent create the energy rather than find the wee group who are already scuttling about happily.
Right. Yes. As far as the hub roles go, we do find some people, as we saw just in that exercise last week, I think it was last week, sometimes people will grab more than one lanyard, and that's okay. They can work where they feel comfortable. We actually do have a questionnaire. It's like a quiz that's this paper version and online version. And we just ask these questions, you know, I like ordering people out, you know, leading people, or I like fixing things, you know, it's one of those. And then they work out what their most suitable hub roles would be. So that's something that we can do in preparedness. It wouldn't happen in response. The challenge again, I think, is how do we keep these groups going without having emergencies? Like COVID's sort of the example of one that just doesn't go away, but normally we hope these things don't happen too often. One of the things I'm interested in experimenting with, and with our lockdowns and things, we haven't really had the chance yet, but is actually working with existing groups to take the hub model, or the model of the roles, and use that for another community event. So I've actually got another residents association. We've been talking about doing this. So, okay, how about using the supervisor and the public information and the needs and offers for a community fair or another event that they're going to do anyway. And so they get used to the concept, and people start exercising their abilities and gifts in these different areas, but in something that they've already pre-planned. One of my colleagues just the other day, they had somebody go missing in their community. And so the family and the community organised a search and rescue process, went on for 2 weeks. Unfortunately, they've just found them deceased, but they used the hub model for that. So she basically just gave them some EOC, emergency operations centre type guidelines, but basically taught them the hub model, and they took that on and used that for this particular community response. So I think like the more we can get people to practice using these sort of roles and discovering how that can work even for their own business as usual type activities, the more they'll be comfortable for it if they need to use it in response.
That's great.
I hope I didn't waffle too much.
No, that's great. And I think actually the idea of the roles on the lanyards is something that I think is really interesting. And I've seen it working at Parkrun as well. You don't need to know people's names, but you do need to know what they're meant to be here for, don't you? LB Knight, you had a question, a more kind of operational question as well. Are you there?
Yep. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you.
Yeah, it was interesting because we had a similar sort of centre set up during the Levels and Moors flooding in Somerset 2013-14, but it was started by completely spontaneous volunteers, and we had a job for the Somerset County Council to get involved in it first of all, and then we developed after the flooding a spontaneous volunteers guide where we would open a centre and people would go there and volunteer to go out and do tasks. But we had a problem with insurance, so the county council didn't want to do third-party insurance for, say, Rotary members taking out groups of volunteers to do things. So are your community hubs insured? Do they have to get their own insurance to cover their things that their volunteers are doing? That's my question.
Our health and safety legislation is kind of strange in that if volunteers are working for a purely voluntary organisation like a spontaneous community organisation or an unofficial one which has no paid employees, then they're not reliable for health and safety. We have an excellent compensation system here that pays for that stuff. So it's not a problem for spontaneous volunteers, but as soon as you have a volunteer agency that, or a social agency that has one or more paid staff, that's when, if they task the volunteers, they're then liable. So that's why in some ways our hub model is kept at like an arm's length from the official response in that sense, because if we start tasking them, we're responsible with the legislation. That's why also we're really keen on getting spontaneous volunteers, and this happened during our COVID, for example, to join up. The Student Volunteer Army is now 10 years old, and that's become quite an organised institution now. So we were getting our unaffiliated volunteers to pop along to them, and they had their own system for handling that.
Right. So it is one of the, sorry, it is one of the things that the council are trying to do is harness the community groups now that have come out from the COVID. So we are working on that.
Yeah, no, okay. I think it is a challenge. Sorry, I don't have any better answers.
No,
for that one.
That's an interesting answer, actually. Thank you.
So a couple of final points. One thing that I was picking up in the chat was Carolyn and Helen Hines from Northumberland. I know Carolyn's from Cumbria and Helen Hines from Northumberland were both picking up on response, you know, people having to be self-motivated in light of Storm Arwen when it could take a long time for help to arrive. Helen, I don't know if you want to come in on anything there.
Well spotted. Probably not very much at this moment in time. I do have another colleague on the call as well from Northumberland. I think just to say that the community hub structure worked well for us, but there was a definite mix of communities who, because it's not something we've done before, in such a rapid response. Obviously, we've worked with communities during COVID, but for this, there was a definite mix of communities who just got on with it, were self-starting and understood what they could do. But there were also other communities who seemed to want permission. So there's a real mix there. So I think this idea of the community hub model and working with communities almost to empower them so they understand what they can do. But I also just wondering, I don't know what the political structure's like in New Zealand, Paul. Do you have like local politicians in the same way that we have local councillors? And if so, do they get involved in this at all? Do you use them as kind of part of the local response?
We have two levels. We have the city councils or district councils. Now, most of the councillors would be either involved in the official response, because it's the city councils that run the emergency operations centres. Again, they could turn up. So we've got some community groups which are quite involved with their local councillors. We also have in some of our cities, we have what we call community boards. They're elected, but they're not like politicians. They're more involved in the community side. And some of them are very actively involved in the hubs model. So it really depends on the person. But again, anybody who can get the community mobilized and focused on these things, it's obviously all welcome. One of the things I think I should mention, and I really like about the hub model, and this is so different to CERT, is that we're very clear that there are no predefined roles. Nobody can say, I'm always going to be the hub supervisor, because of course the problem is, and this is the challenge, you know, when you've got trained volunteers, you don't have enough of them. You rely on that person to always fulfill that role. So the idea that people can turn up, and who maybe we have 2 or 3 trained people, but then they understand that they have to open up the game to everybody to play, so that to be able to fulfill the 8 roles, you need more volunteers as they turn up. So try to create that, break that sort of, you know, sometimes you get those tight groups of very dedicated people that don't let others in. And I think this model helps do away with that a little bit, because they have to have an expanding group. And as the response goes on, that these roles may change and expand, to try and just open it up for everybody.
Thanks, Paul. That's really helpful. Can I just ask you to stop sharing your screen, please? And we've got a couple of last questions, really. Well, Tim Townsend picked up on the connection between the local authority and insurance, and then LB Knight asked about paying for resources. I'm going to just leave your comment in the chat, but LB Knight, if you want to just ask your question, and then that'll be the final question.
Okay. During the flooding in Somerset in 1314, the county council was asked by the hub there, run by spontaneous volunteers, to provide lots of equipment, lots of things like gravel for pathways and all sorts of resources, and they asked us to pay for them, obviously, because they didn't have the money. Does that happen in New Zealand? Who pays?
We certainly found this question during the COVID response, when some people were, you know, very keen to take out food parcels and things, and then we try to make that very clear again, that if they've been tasked by the Emergency Operations Centre, then that comes through our reimbursement process. But a community response like this, we would not, I mean, they could certainly send requests through to the EOC, but we're really trying to encourage that community level of needs and offers, rather than expecting that we will pay for petrol for everybody or anything. So we try to make it clear there's no expectation on reimbursement, unless it's something that's been tasked through the EOC. And of course, we're creating that communication channel. So if there's something that really does need that official response, it can go into the appropriate spreadsheets to get reimbursed later.
Okay, lovely, thank you.
Right, I think that brings our questions to a close there. I was asked to wrap the questions up by 10:30, so not doing too bad. I'm going to hand straight over now to Stuart, who is going to give us a quick summary and wrap up the session.
Good morning. I'll try my best. As Duncan said, a full hour and probably 10 years of working experience with community hubs, trying to condense that into a 5-minute summary of how it's relevant to the UK. Wish me luck. I think the biggest thing which came across is the enthusiasm, obviously from yourself, Paul, but also from the community online. we know what the benefits are. We've been talking about social capital. We've been talking about communities and empowering communities, and the communities being the first responders on scene for years now. Given that we know this, we've seen the models from elsewhere. Why don't we have it in place consistently across the UK yet? What are the obstacles? And we need to start to look at those. What really came across to me, Paul, was the flexibility of the approach. If you've got an existing group, we'll work with you. If there's no group, but there's a need to get a group, we'll see what we can do to assist you. We're not going to give you a big hat and say, you are the leader on this. We'll work with you around how this works. And I think there's a real strength or benefit in that flexibility of approach. With the UK, already we've talked about insurance, health and safety. I think collectively we need to have a look at this and try and come up with some solutions. It's almost too big for resilience officers at a local level to tackle some of these problems. And you think with the UK's published or is in the process of developing a resilience strategy, we've talked about this untapped potential. How do we tap it? How do we make it easier for local areas to be able to do what we need to do to help groups set up? Helen from Northumberland made a really valid point, and I think again it might be something that is endemic to the UK. It's almost looking for permission to step in and do something. I think we in the UK, there's a huge amount of respect for the emergency services. They're seen as the professionals. The reality is, for a number of the incidents we deal with, the community are going to be the first responders. We need to recognise that and have mechanisms in place to incorporate them into the command system. If we look at some of the bigger incidents we've had where groups have set up running parallel but not linked to the command system, and it causes all sorts of issues because the community knows their needs far better than we do. How do we make those links in advance? And also how do we have some mechanism in place where when a group does emerge, we can lock into them and sort of say, right, these are the areas we feel we can work with you on or hand over to yourselves to do, rather than the kind of cold sweat of who are these people, what are they doing? Is there any insurance liability on us as responders if we engage with them? I say the biggest challenge for us is what's the framework, I guess, to save us all trying to work through cultural issues. I think we mentioned about the disparity between some groups. You can see some communities, we could walk up to tomorrow, contact the parish council, and within a week or so there'll be a sign on the council premises door. We can't do that in all communities. Some of the inner cities, how does this work? How does it carry across? There's still a huge amount of networks there. Maybe we're not as good at engaging with them and facilitating them. One of the things which really struck me was around the visibility and that sort of almost normality of the sign on the side of the scout hut or the village hall, and it becomes part of normal life. That's the hub. If people don't know what the sign is, it will come up at some point, but in the back of their head is, this is the location at which we can come to in the event of an incident. I think one of the big selling points, the actual resources required. In terms of a business model, okay, we need some resource to work with the communities, but what we're really talking about is a couple laminated cards saying, here's some structure which you can easily apply. You don't need to have been trained in this. You spill the box, choose your favorite color, and we're off. And we've seen that model work well through a number of emergency sort of setups where, again, it's almost giving permission, giving a couple of bullet points, and you're fine to do this. You can do this, and it will add value. So how do we take that model into the UK? I think is one of the questions. And yeah, really good talk, really beneficial. And again, I suppose the biggest challenge back to us as a community is, okay, we've seen the goods. How do we make it happen? How do we translate that into something in the UK? There are pockets of good practice using this model. Is there a need to look at some consistency and really address those issues, which are the instant stop for us? When we take a proposal to a governance board, instantly the question is going to be asked about risk, insurance, accessibility, GDPR. Can we manage these once nationally? to really let us get on with that engagement with communities and trying to support them to do what they want to do. That's my thought for the day. I'll pass across. Duncan, is there anything further from?
Thought for the day. Thanks, Stuart. That is quite a wide-ranging thought. I guess it comes to me to thank everybody involved. You know, Paul, that's been a great eye-opener for us in terms of what can you do with really on a shoestring budget, but with just a whole group of motivated people, a sign and a box and a radio. So I'm sure that we'll have more conversations around that, Paul. And thank you very much for your time. Claire, thank you for bringing it all together, organising the discussion so expertly, and Stuart, thank you for bringing it all together. I've made a number of notes from your summary as well as from the talk and the questions. In terms of the next webinar, it will be in January. This time we're moving into what national government can do. What can a Ministry for Youth and what they've been doing in Chile. So looking at a top-down approach of involving youth in a very different way. And so you're more than welcome to come to that talk. For NCSR members, there is a meeting this afternoon on strategic communications, one of our working groups that have been set up. So perhaps some of you are involved in that, but no worries if not. And again, I'd just like to close by thanking everybody involved, Paul especially, Claire, Stuart, Roisin, and all of you for joining. So thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.